Welcome back, viewers. You are once again with Bring the Fact. This time, we will uncover the hidden side of a major event that has captured global attention. Israel has issued a chilling ultimatum to Hamas: surrender or face what it calls a hurricane of strikes on Gaza. But what lies behind this threat? Is it purely military strategy or part of a deeper political game that could reshape the Middle East? Stay with us, because the answers may change the way you see this conflict. But before we go deeper, don't forget to press the like and subscribe buttons. That way, you won't miss the hidden facts we will reveal next. The early days of September 2025 brought a wave of escalating tension in the Middle East. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, delivered a chilling ultimatum that quickly reverberated across the globe. In a direct statement on the platform X, he warned Hamas that unless it surrendered and released all hostages, Israel would unleash what he described as a hurricane of strikes upon Gaza. The words were sharp, calculated, and designed to project both fear and inevitability. This was not a vague metaphor. It was a direct promise of overwhelming firepower that would soon engulf Gaza. The threat did not come out of nowhere. In the days leading up to the announcement, Israeli forces had already intensified their bombing campaign. Several tall buildings in Gaza, referred to by Israel as terror towers, had been struck and reduced to rubble. These high-rises were said to house Hamas command centers, but for civilians, they were also homes and workplaces. Footage of collapsing towers quickly circulated online, amplifying the atmosphere of dread. Each strike pushed the city deeper into despair, leaving thousands displaced with nowhere to run. The scale of destruction already weighed heavily on the civilian population. Reports from international agencies highlighted not only the rising death toll, but also the dire state of infrastructure. Electricity was scarce, clean water even scarcer, and hospitals overwhelmed. The humanitarian crisis was no longer looming, it was already here. Aid workers described scenes of families huddled in the dark, children crying for food, and doctors forced to operate without sufficient supplies. Amid this bleak reality, Katz's threat of a hurricane of strikes felt like a declaration that even more suffering was inevitable. What made the statement more alarming was its tone of finality. Katz called it the last warning. The words carried an air of irreversible decision, suggesting that Israel's leadership was prepared to cross a threshold from heavy bombardment into an all-out assault. Military analysts speculated that the phrase hurricane hinted not just at airstrikes, but a combination of artillery barrages and possible ground incursions. The strategy appeared aimed at breaking Hamas's capacity to resist by sheer force, while simultaneously pressuring them into negotiations. In Tel Aviv, the mood among Israel's political leadership was resolute. Many officials framed the ultimatum as the only way to end the conflict. The government's position was simple: Hamas must surrender or face obliteration. Meanwhile, in Gaza City, the atmosphere was the opposite. Anxiety, fear, and resignation permeated daily life. Residents spoke of the dread that every night might be their last, as the sky lit up with flashes of fire and explosions echoed through the streets. The fragile line between military targets and civilian areas grew blurrier with each passing day. Internationally, reactions were mixed. The United States publicly supported Israel's right to defend itself, while European leaders called for restraint and the protection of civilians. Humanitarian organizations urged both sides to seek dialogue, warning that the situation was approaching catastrophic levels. Journalists in the field highlighted the risk that this so-called hurricane could mark one of the deadliest chapters of the war yet. It was not just about military operations, but about the survival of hundreds of thousands of people trapped in the Strip with no safe passage. As the world watched, the question of timing remained uncertain. Would Israel strike immediately, or would there be a brief window for diplomacy to take root? The streets of Gaza offered no time for speculation. Families packed what little belongings they could carry, preparing for the worst. The morning of September 9th, 2025, brought new terror to the residents of Gaza City. The Israeli military issued a sudden evacuation order, demanding civilians leave their homes immediately and move toward the so-called humanitarian zone of Al-Mawasi in southern Gaza. The announcement spread like wildfire, causing panic in crowded neighborhoods already scarred by days of bombings. Families rushed into the streets, carrying children, bags of clothes, and whatever food they could salvage. The order came with a stern warning. Anyone who stayed risked being caught in the coming offensive. But evacuation was easier said than done. Many residents had no means of transport, no fuel, and no money left after nearly 2 years of war. For the elderly and the sick, moving was almost impossible. Parents carried their children for miles under the scorching sun, while others pushed wheelchairs or dragged makeshift carts. Hospitals faced a cruel dilemma. Should they abandon their patients to comply with the order or stay behind and risk destruction? Most doctors refused to leave, choosing loyalty to their patients over their own safety. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of chaos at checkpoints and along the main roads. People were forced to wait for hours, exposed to airstrikes that continued despite the evacuation order. Some families turned back, deciding that staying in their damaged homes felt safer than heading into the unknown. Others never made it to Al-Mawasi at all, caught in the crossfire or simply lost in the mass movement of thousands. Panic spread faster than information, and many questioned whether the so-called humanitarian zone was truly safe. Meanwhile, Israeli strikes continued to hit the city. Buildings crumbled into dust, sending massive plumes of smoke into the sky. Humanitarian groups raised alarms, pointing out that creating a safe corridor meant little if bombs kept falling nearby. Aid workers warned of a catastrophe in the making as food supplies dwindled and clean water became nearly impossible to find. Children fainted from hunger, and mothers struggled to comfort them with nothing but words. The reality on the ground contradicted the promises of safety. International reaction intensified. European leaders expressed concern over forced displacement, while the United Nations called for immediate protection of civilians. Yet appeals for restraint seemed powerless in the face of ongoing bombardments. At the same time, the Israeli government defended its actions as necessary to dismantle Hamas's stronghold in Gaza City. Officials framed the evacuation as a humanitarian gesture, even as images of desperate families contradicted the official narrative. The gap between rhetoric and reality grew wider by the hour. Inside Gaza City, despair deepened. The city's skyline was marked by half-destroyed towers and smoldering ruins. Shops stood empty, and markets that once bustled with life had turned into ghostly stretches of rubble. Residents described walking through streets where silence was broken only by drones overhead and the occasional explosion. For many, there was no place left to hide. Even schools and mosques, once thought of as sanctuaries, were no longer spared. The sense of vulnerability was total.
The death toll continued to climb. Reports indicated that more than 64,000 people had been killed since the conflict began, including nearly 400 who had died of hunger in recent months. The numbers were staggering, but behind each figure were stories of families torn apart and communities erased. Journalists risked their lives to document the suffering, but the destruction was so vast that no single camera could capture its full scope. In this environment, truth itself became a casualty, contested by both sides. As night fell, those who had not evacuated huddled together in basements, praying that the walls around them would hold. Those who reached al-Mawasi discovered overcrowded shelters with barely enough resources to sustain them. Water lines stretched for hours, and Eid trucks struggled to enter due to blocked roads. The promised safety turned into another kind of ordeal, survival in conditions unfit for human life. The evacuation that was supposed to protect civilians had instead deepened their misery, leaving them trapped between bombs and hunger.
While bombs rained down on Gaza and families scrambled to survive, efforts for diplomacy were still alive, though fragile and uncertain. Behind closed doors, negotiations centered around a new ceasefire proposal spearheaded by the United States. President Donald Trump described it as a last chance for both Israel and Hamas to halt the cycle of violence. Mediators hoped that the promise of a temporary truce and the exchange of hostages might open the door to broader talks. But Israel's ultimatum and the looming threat of a hurricane of strikes made the prospect of peace feel increasingly distant. For Hamas, the decision was fraught with risk. Agreeing to surrender would mean political suicide, yet rejecting the proposal could bring even greater devastation upon Gaza. Leaders within the group reportedly debated the terms, balancing military pride against the sheer desperation of their people. Meanwhile, Gaza's civilians found themselves powerless, watching from ruined streets as their fate was decided in distant capitals. For them, the language of ultimatums and proposals translated only into hunger, displacement, and the sound of warplanes overhead. Just as discussions gained momentum, events took a shocking turn. On September 9, 2025, Israeli airstrikes targeted Doha, the capital of Qatar, where several Hamas leaders were based. The attack killed multiple figures, including a Qatar security officer and the son of a senior Hamas commander. The strike narrowly missed top leaders, but its impact was immediate. Qatar, long a mediator in the conflict, condemned the attack as a violation of its sovereignty. The strike sent a chilling message. Even negotiations abroad were not safe from the war's reach. The diplomatic repercussions were swift. Qatar temporarily suspended its role as mediator, while regional powers like Egypt and Turkey voiced outrage. International observers questioned Israel's motives, asking whether the goal was truly to end the conflict through diplomacy or to crush Hamas at any cost. Western allies found themselves caught in the middle. Washington criticized the attack but stopped short of condemning Israel, fearing a break in strategic alignment. European leaders, however, grew more vocal in demanding accountability and an immediate ceasefire. For residents of Gaza, the strike in Doha symbolized the collapse of hope. Many had pinned their survival on the possibility of negotiations. Now that path appeared blocked by fire and fury. Aid groups on the ground warned that every delay in diplomacy translated into more deaths, more children starving, and more families destroyed. The so-called humanitarian zone of al-Mawasi was already overcrowded and undersupplied, leaving thousands vulnerable to disease and malnutrition. Hope was replaced by anger, and anger by despair. Journalists covering the conflict highlighted the unprecedented nature of the moment.
Rarely had a conflict combined such massive military escalation with such deep diplomatic fractures. The attack on Qatar blurred the line between battlefield and negotiation table, making diplomacy itself a target. Analysts warned that if talks collapsed entirely, the war could expand beyond Gaza, pulling in neighboring states and igniting a regional conflagration. The stakes had never been higher, and yet the world seemed unable to prevent the spiral. In the midst of the chaos, civilians clung to fragments of normal life. Families shared scarce meals. Parents whispered stories to calm terrified children, and religious leaders urged communities not to lose faith. In the ruins of Gaza City, prayers rose alongside plumes of smoke, each voice a plea for mercy in a world deafened by bombs. The contrast between diplomacy's fragile language and the brutal reality on the ground was stark. While leaders debated terms, people struggled simply to survive the night. The future remained uncertain. Whether through surrender, escalation, or fragile diplomacy, the next phase of the conflict promised to shape not only the fate of Gaza, but also the political landscape of the entire region. The hurricane threatened by Israel had not yet struck in full force, but its shadow loomed larger every day. In the eyes of the world, Gaza stood as both a battlefield and a bargaining chip, caught in the crossfire of politics, power, and survival.
As the dust of conflict continues to rise over Gaza, one thing remains clear: the line between war and diplomacy grows thinner by the day. Threats of overwhelming force, the chaos of evacuation, and the fragile threads of negotiation reveal a crisis that is both human and political. Behind every headline are lives struggling to endure, and every strike carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. This is not just a story of power, but of survival, resilience, and the search for justice in a world divided. Thus ends the chain of facts we have uncovered today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bring the Fact channel and activate the notification bell so you won't miss the unveiling of other crucial truths.